Welcome everybody to the panel session, Thinking Together, WHO, World Health Organization, that is, practitioners and researchers bridging the gaps in evidence between evidence and action in emergencies. And I'm delighted to be able to introduce a panel who are of practitioners and researchers who are doing just that, because we have three members of the first ever technical advisory group on risk communication, community engagement, and infodemic management established by the World Health Organization. And we also have the WHO, World Health Organization official, who is the link between that group and the World Health Organization's Regional Office for Europe, which is advised by the group. And so at this point, I'm maybe going to ask the panel to introduce themselves for the benefit of the audience here, but also the online audience. And I'll start with the person I mentioned as the bridge between the advisory group and WHO, who is literally bridging a gap. Christiana, please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Ben. I'm the bridge. So my name is Christiana Salvi, and I work for the World Health Organization in the European region. I'm based in Copenhagen, and I am the lead for this area of work that Ben was mentioning, risk communication, community engagement, infodemic management. We call it with the acronym RCCE-IM, and we are actually putting them all together as a scientific discipline that we are going to talk today about. So that's for me. Okay,
and next to you we have Ejana.
Yeah, so hello everyone. My name is Ejana Jumalieva. I'm Dean of Journalism and Mass Communication Department at American University of Central Asia, Bishkek, Kyrgyzstan.
I'm Audrey Diers-Lawson, a professor of risk and crisis communication at Christiania University in Oslo, Norway.
And my name is Brigitte Strawald. I'm coming from Germany, from the LMU University in Munich, and I'm a researcher there.
So how we're going to structure this session is we're going to have 3 rounds of questions asked by me, a sort of a moderated session. And whilst that's happening, our audience here are going to think up some insightful questions to ask, and then we will open up the discussion to you. And we're going to start with the challenges. So Christiana, if I could turn to you, I mean, what are the key barriers that you, as a practitioner of RCCE-IM in WHO, see in collaborating with researchers?
Thank you, Ben. I hope this is working well. So yes, I'm looking now from the perspective of an RCCE-IM practitioner. Okay, many microphones. And I think that I have it pretty clear. It narrows down to 3 key words, and it's about research that is timely, that is of quality, and it's operational. So I go back to my experience of many years ago. I've been working in this area for the last over 20 years with WHO, and I'm going back to one of my initial deployments in 2007 in the Republic of Congo on an Ebola outbreak. And I remember being on this team, multidisciplinary team, and I was tasked with risk communication. And there was this social scientist in our team. And we had like 1 month of deployment. And I remember this first conversation with her, and she was saying that she will use this month to gather these results from the community. And at the end of the month, she would put them together in a report. And I remember asking myself the question, is this how it works? Because, I mean, I needed to hit the ground running, and I needed to produce something like the day after to save people lives now, not in a month. And I was like, how is it going to work? And to me, the first challenge was clearly time, and it continued to be time. I mean, in the last 4 years ago, I was tasked to lead the COVID response in Europe, and I was leading the RCCE-IM response for many other emergencies. You might know that Europe has been hit by a number of emergencies for the last 4 years, including the war in Ukraine and then the earthquake in Turkey and many others. And the time is still the challenge, because basically during these emergencies, we are under so much pressure, unbelievable pressure. And I would talk to a scientist, to someone, a researcher, who give me a result only if those results make sense in my world. If it's basically just research for the sake of research, I don't have the time. So, and in the last years, basically, we had seen so much research that has been produced, but is that research a research that makes sense for me? So I've been talking about the time, but let me talk now about the quality. And of course, when we want something which is very rapid, we also need to rely on these scientific results. So we can't really compromise on the quality. So these two elements need to come together. And the third element is operational. Because again, when there is a crisis, when there is an emergency, I enter a meeting with the WHO response team, and I need to present those results in just a few minutes. And the next question to me is, so what are you going to do with those results? So what is the action? And I don't have the time. My team doesn't have the time to go through multiple studies and multiple survey polls and multiple peer review articles and get sense of them. So I would say that the way this research, and we have seen so many papers and so many studies coming up, the way this research is structured, the language and the length, is just of a different world compared to my pressure of doing things here and now. So I would say, to me, again, the three key points are time, quality, and operational. And I would repeat them over and over during this panel session. Over from me.
Audra, you look like you'd like to respond or give a perspective from a researcher's point of view.
So I think one of the challenges also with the way that academic structures work is that if you're a young scholar, it's really hard to participate and do this because you have a lot of things and a lot of mess on your plate. So you can't exactly drop everything to whether it's teaching, whether it's your other projects, to do research that is rapid response. And so this becomes one of the key challenges is access for those of us who are, we won't say older, we will say more advanced in our careers. It's a little bit easier because we have a little bit of time and space. We may have PhD students who can support. We just have a bit more opportunity to do this. But at the same time, as Christiana says, what we produce is often not particularly usable in the moment because we write for academic journals and we write for academic audiences. And as my husband likes to say, why say in a paragraph what you can say in 20 pages? And so I think one of the things that we have critically failed at, and so a big barrier, is translating our research so that it is usable, so that it's accessible. And you know, I know that a number of my friends and I have talked about this, that we had all this research around the pandemic and it just wasn't getting used, which you could, from one side, you could say those practitioners, they really should be better about this, but the point of time ends up being the problem. They simply don't have the time to wade through 300 papers. And that was in 2022. That was one of the things that I did, was waded through the COVID risk and crisis communication research to that point in just 11 countries in Europe. And that's no small feat to try and get some insights. So I think that this ends up being one of the critical challenges and critical barriers, is both the pace of work on our side and also delivering something that is useful for practitioners.
Jana, I know that you've got some comments about, well, practitioners and researchers in Central Asia, and maybe introduce those who don't know where Central Asia is.
So first of all, we have like several challenges. Central Asia, it's former Soviet Union countries, and it's 5 countries, and overall it's 79 million people. And I don't know, have you ever been there or have you heard about? No, yeah, okay. So, and that's why we have a lot of problems in terms of the practitioner and academia. So there is a lot of there's a lack of data. And however, we have to realize that we have to have a more kind of work together with the academia and with the practitioner, because what the usually government is doing is just awaiting some data information from the Western countries, but it's not sustainable, and we have to know and learn about our specific things. And another story that all 5 countries has a different languages. And one official language for all 5 countries was Russian. And now we are in a transition in many levels. But I think the another challenge that we are not so close to the European countries, but still want to create this culture of academia. For instance, we have American university in my country, in Kyrgyzstan, in Bishkek, which is like not bad because English never was our official second, third language. It's not existed in our region. But anyway, we are doing a lot of efforts on that to be linked to the global kind of studies, which is, I think, really important to all of us. And another thing that economical situation also impact to the research and to the practitioners. I think we don't have a strong academia, just a few institutions, but there would be maybe new collaboration, and we're expecting that it will change if we realize that it's really important.
Okay, thank you, Ajana. Brigitte, what do you see as the challenges and the barriers?
Well, one of the key challenges in crisis is scientific uncertainty, and this is inherent in crises and inevitable. And especially when we have a new pathogen like SARS-CoV-2, we didn't know that before. Now, I'm coming from a WHO collaborating center for evidence-based public health. So I'm not only from the communication perspective, but also the public health perspective. And when we remember back in early 2020, which seems so long ago, but I think we'll remember that we didn't even understand how SARS-CoV-2 was transmitted. So there was uncertainty about that, meaning uncertainty about what can we do to protect ourselves and others. So which measures would work, but also which measures would do more harm than good. And one example was the discussion about school closures. And school closure was a hot debate, I think, internationally. There was uncertainty. Would that help to stop or limit the spread of the virus? Because we didn't know whether children could be potential pandemic drivers or not. So we didn't know that, and we didn't know that whether or how the unintended consequences would be if we close the schools. We anticipated there would be some. So, and all this uncertainty, because we didn't have any studies on SARS-CoV-2, because we didn't have SARS-CoV-2 before. So evidence was more or less to zero. We could take flu as another virus, but of course we understood we can't translate that one-to-one to this new pathogen. So what we only can offer in these under these circumstances is kind of a best available evidence. And this is changing over the time, hopefully rising, but it takes its time until we can really talk about evidence in its essence, like we define it usually. But, and there's the point when we talked about what practitioners need, but what we as researchers also need is the cooperation and the communication at that point. Meaning we need to understand what do you need most urgently, and we need to make something like an evidence triage. So what's really information needs today rather than tomorrow, but as soon as possible. And what do you think, what will come later? Which information will you need later? Because that's a typical pandemic evolution. And that would help us to use our resources best, because we always talk about resources, and that's what you described. They are limited, both person, but also software and all the things around. And that's where I think we need to better communicate in future to understand how what you need, but also what we need from a researcher's perspective, and at the end have a better outcome at that point.
Okay, thank you very much. So if we now turn to the solutions of how do we actually bridge the gap between the practitioners and researchers, Christiana, what do you see as the solutions available to us?
Yeah, I think that already talking about the challenges, some solution came up, but I will refer again back to this experience I had in 2007 in DRC. So at that point, I mean, working with the social scientists in the way that the team was, I mean, the mission was actually structured was not a thing. So what I did, and again, we are talking more than 15 years ago, I partnered with the surveillance team. So I decided to repurpose the very long questionnaire that was developed at them, and very specific tailored question. I partnered with the surveillance team. I included this question in their own questionnaire, and I also went out like the first week on a flat visit and gathered these insights. And of course, I compromised on quality. That's clear. But at least I had something, and I developed some messaging and some content that then I tested. So this is what happened like over 15 years ago. And then I can refer to something that I did in 2022 when the Ukraine war started. And I immediately went out in the first weeks in Poland and in the Republic of Moldova, because we not only had to tackle the situation in Ukraine, but also in neighboring countries for the refugees who were relocating. And there, it was a two-person team. It was me, and it was a social scientist. And in that situation, the social scientist was completely aligned with the purpose. So the type of intervention was definitely better structured, but it was still timely and operational. In 2 weeks, we had some good insights that we used to develop a booklet for refugees at the point of entry for them to be able to navigate the health system, because this was the main priority for them. And a year later, there was a social scientist team that came up with results of a year study, and the results were fully aligned with our initial intervention. This is not to say that one intervention is better than the other. What I want to say here is that we need to identify the right intervention at the right time. I think it actually links with what Birgit was saying. So we need to understand what is the need, and we need to select that specific intervention. So if I want to look at a couple of solutions that we're doing here, and Ben, I will be very quick.
Okay.
So one is, for instance, as we speak, we are finalizing a capability mapping tool for RCCE-IM practitioners, meaning some benchmarks against which this practitioner can assess their capability. There is a section on evidence generation, because of course, evidence generation is at the basis of everything that we do on risk communication, community engagement, and infodemic management. We have identified there, for instance, online listening as the way to inform rapid intervention. Offline listening maybe is a little bit more short and medium term. And then we have longer term research that is actually for more strategic planning and actually future intervention. And the second solution is what Ben was mentioning, is the RCCE-IM tag that I established last year. Actually, we are going next month to meet to mark 1 year of the tag, which is the first ever. And there are different ways in which the tag provides advice to WHO. There can be quick and dirty meetings on a Teams on a campaign on COVID or Mpox, or we have working groups on topics that need more research and more time, like artificial intelligence or health literacy or research. I mean, bridging the gap. So I think, again, this is maybe an example of this partnership and can be replicated in different ways. But I think that we are more and more thinking of the solution. And maybe that question that I had 15 years ago, is this how it works? Is that really guided a little bit my approach to finding the solution, and partnering with the researcher is definitely a great way to do that.
Yeah. Okay. So, Brigitte, what do you think about being fast and flexible? I mean, what are your experiences on that?
Well, it is difficult. And in a way, it's like Audra clearly explained, our research system isn't really made for that and not prepared for that. But nevertheless, I mean, as I said, we're in a bit specific position as a WHO collaborating center for evidence-based public health. So we literally switched to a pandemic mode in early 2020. And that was a decision we've made within our team. And we discussed that, we wanted to make that, and we could make that fully aware of the cost of that. Personal cost of career, cost of money, because the resources were not there. So we had to take them from more or less out of the pocket. But that was a decision. Because it was a situation we were not waiting for, but we were prepared for, and when, if not then, well, working for that. And well, one major project were school guidelines. So which measures could be taken in schools to protect the children, to make schools working during a pandemic. And we coordinated and created and implemented this guideline. And this was a process that was really new for us all. And we, of course, looked at the evidence first. We looked at what was there, school measures for children during a pandemic. So we knew before starting the search that this would be very, very limited. More indirect than direct evidence, but nevertheless, we made rapid reviews on measures, but also on unintended consequences in a very, very rapid mode. So that was the evidence backup in a way. And but we also knew that for formulating recommendations, we need another approach, and that's why we choose this guideline approach, a very structured one, where we said, okay, let's start with the evidence, but then we will build a stakeholder panel. And the stakeholder panel was with all stakeholders who have to deal with schools. So these were the medical experts, meaning infectiology, pediatrics, public health, epidemiology, etc. But also members of the school family, meaning students, parents, teachers, health authorities as well, and practitioners. So we had a really quite wonderful stakeholder panel, a very enthusiastic one as well. And then we had, were guided by the WHO Integrate framework. And this framework, we have built that or developed that together with WHO time ago, not thinking about a pandemic situation, but we thought this would be good. What does it mean? This framework is a guideline or a tool to look at the quality of the evidence on the one side, but also taking a whole of society perspective, meaning that we also consider things like equality or equity and social consequences, but also financial consequences and feasibility, things like that, so that we have a way more complex view on a problem, and in that case on the school measures. And that was very helpful to formulate the recommendations, especially when we saw we don't have real evidence, but we have to formulate these recommendations, and these are then consensus-based from a stakeholder panel that is as broad as we have built it. And we made these recommendations very transparent because we documented what's the basis for it, what are the arguments pro and con, and why did we decide then on this sentence on this formulation of the recommendation. And we presented it in understandable formats so that even teachers or practitioners or health authorities could see on one view, what is it about? And what is it based on? And talking about time, well, we started in December 2020, and the first version was already in February 2021, which is for research in ultra rapid mode. We really worked 24/7 during that time.
So sometimes it's possible when you're
And
in an
yes.
extreme situation.
Sometimes it's possible, but it's a sprint mode, and you can't do that as a marathon.
No.
So it was an exceptional situation. And I can only stress we were not paid for that. So we need solutions
Okay.
to make that.
Audrey, would you have solutions? Or examples of good practice at least?
So, yeah, but in some ways, yes and no, because I think part of when we think about a lot of this, we need a convergence of science communication, and we also need a convergence with the practitioners. And this is about network building, plain and simple. So if I think about it, in I think 2016, I happened to meet Ben at this conference. And so we got to talking. And it was a good chat about practitioner stuff, about academic stuff. And then, good few years later, seeing each other over time, he sends an email and said, "Hey, would you like to come to Albania and chat with a group of folks in the Western Balkans about COVID?" Why, yeah. So a lot of this is very much about taking opportunities, building up networks, generally saying yes to some stuff too. So in terms of solutions, part of it is letting people know that we want to do the work, and that sometimes we're not going to get hours, sometimes we're not going to get paid, but sometimes there's opportunities that outweigh a lot of that. And so there have been some really nice collaborations with the Asia Europe Foundation, also with the EU COVID committee, where we did a very academic thing, which was look at the 330 articles that were written between 2020 and 2022 about COVID in 11 countries in Europe, and said, so what can we figure out about best practices here? So these are different types of examples of opportunities where we can add value, but also where we take these opportunities. And so you may end up in a random place like Kazakhstan. I haven't made it to Kyrgyzstan yet, but you get these opportunities, and this is why, as researchers, we need to do good research. We need to chat with people, is that this lets us have opportunities that is about opening in these conduits and opening these conversations and generally being available as we can. There is a luxury of time, especially as you get more advanced in your career and you have data and things like that. But at the same time, it's also getting to know one another. It's also having the conversations that let us think bigger. And that's a lot of it is about how do we think bigger about these collaborations themselves.
Well, that's great. Ajana, any solutions? Realize that we're taking a bit of time on the solutions, and then we'll go a bit faster when we talk about the future.
Yeah, so I'm agree with Audra in many levels. So first of all, if we talk about Central Asia, we have 5 countries, but we are not so close to each other in terms of the working together on research. For instance, we have to think what we can do all together as a practitioners and as academia to have a better connection and foster cooperation between countries. For instance, we don't have any projects in Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, and I don't know why it's going right like this. And unfortunately, we have so many things what we can do, but I work more with the maybe Western countries because I'm working at the American institution. But I believe that as a region, Central Asia has to work together, and first of all, figure out and work and learn about ourselves. Like we have to learn about ourselves, about our country, because there is a lack of information, and we have to focus on the research and focus on our countries. And we have limited activities within the country, within the Central Asian countries. I don't know. I'm frequently flying, I think, to Europe and to the US, right, and then to Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, and I know that there's a situation related to the politicians, most probably, and there is many things. But transparency is one of the key factor, because we also have problem, I think, and we feel pressure in terms of the crisis communication when it comes to any crisis. It's lack of transparency, and there is some limitations. And I think academia is one of the places when we have to think, and we have to still talk about that without any political and political things, just because it's really important for the people.
Okay, so if we now look to the future of the next, say, 2 or 3 years, how do you see this area evolving, Audra, and what can we do to attract the attention of the decision makers who can maybe help remove some of the barriers to cooperation?
Well, I think there's a lot to be said for when we talk about the CE part of RCCE-IM, the community engagement. Likewise, in our part, there needs to be a co-creation between practitioners and academics. And so there are 3 things that I think we can do as part of a co-creation effort. One is certainly producing a research agenda that is useful for practitioners in genuine prevention. A lot of times when we talk about risk communication, we actually end up talking about reactionary things. We need to talk about prevention a lot more. And so being future oriented and building capacities, and you only do that once you know and define what the problems are, what the gaps are, and how to fill those in a way that is useful. Second is a bit better dissemination of academic research. We as the academics need to be responsible and take the time to translate the information for each and every one of our projects. So as we publish something, we probably ought to produce like a 500 to 700 word popular science version of it that is digestible, a 5 to 7 minute presentation of it that we can post online. These are things that we ought to be doing as a matter of course, so that they can be assembled and so that they can be more readily accessible. And third is thinking about developing rapid response toolkits, so that the prep work in the research methodology can make the good use of our research knowledge, but in a way that is actually useful and short, so that we're not sacrificing quality, we're just doing it a lot faster and a lot better.
Aijana, do you have thoughts on the
Yeah,
future?
I think it's why our region also could be important. I think that the project or the things what could be done in Central Asia also could be useful for other countries, like because in right now we are just like not independent, and we are depending what would be done in the Western countries. But we have our maybe cultural or economical different situation, and I think in the future, if we will invest in the research and we will have a good collaboration with the practitioner, all these things could be in terms of the scale useful in other countries as well. So I think in the future would be great to have a research and maybe investing in research and a strong academia collaboration between whole countries, not only in Kyrgyzstan or not only in Bishkek, but the whole countries like Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan. I think it's quite important.
Okay, thank you. And Brigitte, what are your thoughts on the future and attracting attention to remove barriers?
Well, as an overall goal, I wish we can end in thinking about us and them. So us, the researchers, and them, the practitioners, and realizing that we have the same goal, but we have different roles and different responsibilities, but we are a team and we aim for the same. So I'm also looking for a shared mindset between the research practitioners, but also health authorities. We are really better together, and we should forget that. We should have the respect from one each other, but also sometimes more patience, maybe. Well, and as a researcher, I wish we understand more that RCCE-IM are complex interventions in complex settings. So this is really something different as a usual simple intervention. These are interventions, and it's not the one versus placebo, but it's not in a vacuum, and we have to consider all these influences and factors outside there. And for that, we need better research methods, adapted methods, and maybe even new methods, and we have to work on that. And the last point is a very practical one. To do all that, especially in an emergency situation, very practically, we need the research infrastructure, meaning data repositories, study protocols, and templates ready to use so that we can start immediately.
Okay, thank you. And then Christiana, how do you see this area evolving in the future, and how do we remove barriers?
I think it came pretty clear that the solution is the title of our panel discussion, Thinking Together. I mean, I think we need to come really close and understand each other's need, but also have a mapping of the options available based on the objectives that we both want to achieve, and select, again, the right intervention at the right time. But at the end of the day, it also comes to increasing the commitment and the investment on this type of research that, again, is timely, quality, and operational. And to do that, we need to work together, and also advocate to create a system that enables us, based on our needs, to do that. I want to share with you what we are doing in WHO Europe. And again, WHO, the regional office for Europe, is a pretty big region. It's 53 countries, not only European Union, but Central Europe and Central Asia and Caucasus. So it's really, really big region and very diverse. And of course, we have Ajana here representing the Central Asian countries. So what we are doing is really to position this high in member states' agenda. And we are developing a new strategy and action plan on health emergencies to enhance preparedness and response. And it's taking stock of the lesson we learned from the last emergencies. And that's why it's called Preparedness 2.0. And one big portion of this strategy is community protection, which means basically working together with communities and co-create intervention based on their needs. RCCE-IM is mainstreamed. This is a transformative shift, because only a few years ago, the previous action plan had one paragraph on risk communication. Here we are talking of a system which is at the same level of all the other systems, talking surveillance, clinical care, countermeasure, that actually achieve their impact at the community level through the community protection. What we're doing here is to finalize the strategy and put on the table of the ministers at the next meeting of the governing body in October 2024 for their adoption and endorsement. A big element of this is actually bridging the gap between research and action. The type of research that we need is the type of research that is actually looking at, for instance, what is the enables and barriers to adopt a specific behavior, or what are the impacts of RCCE-IM on people behavior and also on the controlling of emergency. And this is research that has been really lagging behind compared to biomedical research. So this is the investment that we want minister to prioritize. We have been trying to attempt this also through some return on investment studies that we have produced to actually show the return on investment on this. And we need, and by this, through this partnership between researchers and practitioners, we can show this more. So we think that this is an ambitious agenda, but this is actually the momentum here and now. I've been working again in this area for the last over 20 years. I've never seen this momentum. And if we don't take it now, we will never take it. So I really think that this is the time that we come together and really make a difference in the way this issue is addressed and can make a difference in people's life. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Christiana. Now, do we have some questions from the audience? Amiso.
First, I want to commend all the panelists. You've really shared with us some very important information that I want to take home with. And I also want to say this is one of the first few, if not the only conference that I attend that brings together scholars and practitioners. And I want to really highlight, or rather comment on what Audra said. We write for ourselves. The reality is that scientists and engineers and computer experts have been doing this for a long time. And what you've just shared with us now, what she said about basically putting our research in capsule form and having a white paper and things like that and sharing with a wider audience, it's very, very important. The thing is, we need to take it to the market, because when I go to all these big conferences and I bring it up at smaller sessions and they tell me, we don't have time for that. We must do that, as you've just rightly mentioned. We must do that. So it's really incumbent upon us, as they've very beautifully shared with us, to take our research. This conference gives us that opportunity, take our research and produce it in such a way that practitioners would find it useful. And so we can actually see our research at work. So thank you for putting together this panel and sharing this very important information with us. Thank you.
I would like to just add on to that the question that Miso built up to that I think we need to ask right now. The International Crisis and Risk Communication Association is newly formed, and that means we aren't stuck in the mud of the ritual, traditional ways of doing research. So my question to you is, I hear you saying that you don't have time. So one of the things that this association might want to do is synthesizing the research while we have time to do that, with systematic reviews, with meta-analyses, and then translating that into smaller bite-sized portions that can be digestible quickly. And then transparency, the idea of making them accessible to the practitioners around the world in different countries and different languages. So the question that this begs is, what can this organization do to make our research accessible in a timely fashion around the world across language barriers and country barriers? Is it print? Is it online? Is it a YouTube channel? What is that digestible channel that will be most useful to you?
Now, I think, first of all, this is exactly what we need. I mean, to make this research digestible, and not necessarily only the research that is produced during an emergency, but also what has been produced already many years and in many settings and in many circumstances, because there's so much. Every time I enter a new emergency, everybody starts talking about what we can reproduce. Let's also take stock of what is out there. What you are saying now is so valuable. Let's find a way to already use and in a digestible way and make it available. The format, I would definitely say digital, less printed, also because we need countries across the world to access it. And so digital would be great, but I'm not necessarily focusing here on the channel. I'm focusing on the format. It needs to have executive summary. It needs to have, maybe we can also develop a standardized way to do that. You can have one initial executive summary and then very quickly the methodology and maybe, and then the conclusion, but it shouldn't be across 20 pages. It should be across one page. So to me, that's what makes the difference.
Thank you.
Thank you. So thank you guys today for your insight. It's been amazing. There's a few things I wanted to touch upon, which maybe is a little bit of an alternative perspective from someone like myself, who I would say is trying to be a bridge gapper. So if you think about taking it all the way back to when you are actually applying for jobs. So if we think about the traditional way of how we apply any information compared to today, applying for jobs online, it's really hard to actually find roles and positions in the industries across the board to start with, where we can actually inject this information. That would be where the bridge gappers can link with researchers. I'm not sure if you would agree with that.
And the reason why it's actually quite hard to find these jobs in areas that aren't in industries that typically face these crises is because, like Mizo said, people just don't deem it as important until the crisis comes about. And then they're like, okay, what do we do about it? And even after a crisis or a pandemic happens, you know, it blows over, they say, thank God it's gone now. And they don't think about how to apply response strategies and ways to prevent this from happening using the learnings. So that's just like a general problem that I've observed in my attempts to break through in a non-conventional manner. I'm coming over from the UAE, from Dubai, and I work independently. I have a consultancy where I've actually tried to apply this mindset as a sales tool when trying to gain different sort of business relationships. And I thought, I don't know if this is really a question or more suggestions or something for you guys to consider, but I think in this day and age, we can apply technology, we can apply AI and all these things, but at the end of the day, we need to apply the change of mindsets from general industries, not just the high risk industries. And through that is this bringing it back to the simplicity of conversations. And like Audra said, you know, utilizing your network, you know, a lot of the time it's quite overwhelming when you give a really in-depth report, or even if you give a video that goes through it all, but actually using your network and being able to use it in a sales perspective. So I've got very, you know, vast network, let's say in the UAE, where I have access to ministers and His and Her Excellencies up until the royalty. And you look at me and you probably would never think it, but it's just about who you know. And sometimes I don't need to be the person that gives the spiel, let's say, but I could be the connector between a researcher and a practitioner. And I believe that there's probably a lot of other individuals who can do that. And you think about the UAE who aim to be the first in applying change in innovation, and, you know, look at what's going on right now in Palestine. They're one of the first to put out resources, injecting, you know, real capital into the country to help aid the issue that's going on. So I feel like these are the types of ears that we could be gaining, you know, from, and it just takes a few simple people. And maybe the question that I have then from the association is, what can be done in order to create the backing for individuals or smaller organizations who have the access to the ears and the network that you're looking to actually put this message across to? Does that make sense? I don't know if I just rambled then.
This goes along the lines of what you're saying, Deanna, in terms of what can the association do. I think there's a really nice opportunity with the ICRCA about thinking about it as a think tank. And so when we have contacts like Christiana, who's doing so much work to make RCCE-IM a meaningful part. And I think this has certainly changed the way I think about risk and crisis communication. So the last couple of years of collaborating with the WHO has informed my research agenda in some fairly meaningful ways, and also just the general philosophical approach to this. But I think that creating networks and creating think tanks and delivering something is something that some of us who are, I think we can do that. I think we can at least start the conversation.
Those of us who are experienced in the field for a long time, or however you put it so nicely, Audra, realize that there has been a changing tide. It's different. It's different now. There is a real desire to co-create knowledge that's applied and meaningful and makes a difference in the world. The siloed thinking of the academic is breaking down. And so we need to not let that get built back up. And so we're looking for ways to figure out together, how do we make it more meaningful? We don't want it to be just research for the sake of research.
Very quickly, I just want to add a point. And because here I'm also talking to universities, I mean, something can also start at the university level. Because, for instance, RCCE-IM is a profession that doesn't really exist. I mean, now there is a momentum because of COVID, particularly in the context of public health. But risk communication, community engagement, infodemic management coming together, at least in Europe, is a pretty new field. So what we are doing in WHO Europe, we are talking to universities now and embed these in curricula of medical students or students in public health and communication. We could also include this element of how you want to do research in different ways to address the need. Because at the end of the day, we don't need necessarily to go to train the professionals. We want to catch them early and actually train them as they are studying at the postgraduate and undergraduate levels.
Thank you. So I also want to appreciate the panel. And as Christiana was talking, I totally could understand with her, because I also lead the RCCE-IM team for my organization, and I could feel all the pain points. And key thing every day is, so when I look at the research team, I'm like, I'm in the middle of a crisis, for heaven's sake. What exactly are you telling me to, again, at the initial session, and they were talking and they were like, oh, interviewed 40 people. I told my colleague that came with me that serves as a researcher on my team, I was like, if I tell you to do something and you interview 40 people, you tell me that's not enough evidence and that you can make meaningful use of the data from just speaking to 10, 40 people. And to what extent, what's the time to actually wait for you to come up with this as you're battling COVID, there's Lassa, there's Mpox, there's this, there's so many, and really, where's the midline, where's the midpoint? So one of the things I always have at the back of my mind, and I appreciate the work that WHO does, is, okay, start with what you know, because you need to communicate, you need to still say something out, you can't wait till you have it all figured out. So my first steps will always be what's known. Again, what's the minimum general information that needs to go out? People also forget that communication is a process. They just think you go out and just say a message. But there's a thinking behind communicating. There's a message, the messenger, the tone that goes into designing an effective communication message. It's not just about telling people what to know. Your message should be able to make them take an action. So people think communication is just, oh, we've given you this and then go ahead. But there is a science to communication that is normally missing in the way people look at risk communication, that you must be communicating what your audience needs to do in a way they can take those decisions. So understanding the science of communication itself is missing along the line within the whole technical areas for IHR. Risk communication is always seen as the last point, and they just come and meet you at the very last minute and say, oh, people are not doing what we asked them to do. But from the onset, you didn't put it in. So one of the key things I'm taking from this session is really that interconnectivity of working together. And I also say a missing point is also trying to work closer with the surveillance team. They go out, they go and collect the data, but we miss that linkage, and they already have some tools. It's just, what can we add on? Because they don't see it as a necessity, but understanding the perception of the same people that you're going to meet is also really important, and we could get that data at that point. So it goes beyond us having the tools. We also need to know at what point can we also collect the data in a way that it's also, that can allow us to make timely decisions, and working closer also with the surveillance. It's a key point. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much for that input, and I really like how you I like your approach. And you mentioned the problems with the evidence, and this is something we often face, and that's why I stress so much that we need to adapt our methods and maybe even find new methods. We have, of course, the traditional evidence term and a very puristic definition of it. And learning now that we have these complex interventions in complex environments. So we can't really use the old methods for everything we're facing today. And we have quantitative methods, but we also have qualitative methods, and we have mixed methods. And so we have to adapt that. And this is one of the most urgent tasks for research, I would say. So sometimes, 40 interviews are quite a lot in certain situations. Mm-hmm. And of course, but I have to know what we can find out with that. But what we cannot find with these methods, there are limitations. We have to face them and we have to label it very, very clearly and transparent. But nevertheless, it's a very useful information at that time point. And just to add, I think one lesson we've learned is also tell the people what we know initially, but also what we don't know.
Yes.
And this is, I think, the honesty in that situation that is needed, that we have gaps currently. We cannot answer certain questions.
Right.
There are some we can answer, others we cannot answer. And this has to be made transparent because otherwise we lose trust, as we have seen. So but thank you very much for your input.
Thank you so much. Liz Petrin-Sayers, I'm a social scientist with the federal government and a teacher with Johns Hopkins University. So related to this point about kind of bridging uncertainty and scientific information, one of the things I haven't heard come up is misinformation. And so I am wondering if that's something that the panelists are thinking about. And if so, how are you approaching that in your work? Thank you.
Christiana, yes.
Okay, I love the question. Thank you for asking that. Okay, so uncertainty, and this is exactly what Birgit was talking now. I mean, we know perfectly that this has been one of the main challenges of organizations and countries across the pandemic, right? So it is normal during a pandemic, during an emergency like that, that guidance changes based on the evolution of science. That's clear. What is not normal is to be criticized for that. So it means that that's something that is not working, which is not only speaking in uncertainty, but declaring the uncertainty. Because people, public opinion, media, whoever, they don't like grays. They like black and white, but science is gray. So, and that's what we know. So it's about really engaging people. I don't use the term educate, because to me, educate is one way. To me, it's really about engaging people, stakeholders, understanding how science works. What we're doing now is a project on health literacy that is exactly about that. And it's basically mapping the risks of different, I mean, at the regional level, so the European region, but also at the level of single countries, and increase literacy on those risks, but also increase the understanding of how science works. And this is one element. Health literacy is also going to be the basis to address false information narratives, because we know, and we have in Europe, basically we have established this program that actually bridges the three elements. I mean, it's called RCCE-IM. They come all together because one lives on the other. I mean, I'm really convinced about that, and Ben knows, he works with me, that without, I mean, risk communication doesn't really work without community engagement, infodemic management, and the other way around. So, and in the context of infodemic management, I'll close very, very soon. So we know that there are different types of intervention, among which there is pre-banking or inoculation. Part of inoculation, which is actually trying to prevent or mitigate the risk, is also health literacy, which again includes how to understand science. So we can talk later aside. I mean, there's so much to say, but definitely your question is spot on.
I'm going to add 2 quick points. I have a 7-nation study on vaccination that basically suggests on this uncertainty point that uncertainty means that people look for, while their first choice is for official sources of information, the more uncertain they are, the more likely they are to look to alternative sources for information. And then the second, in the UK, I had the chance to do data collection on vaccination attitudes and an experiment where they got the same information before the pandemic, before the vaccination was released, and then after people were largely vaccinated in Tim and Deanna's new book, shameless plug. But what we found was that people's understanding, their basic comprehension of the same message went down throughout the pandemic because of how much information, how much complexity, and I would argue how much uncertainty was produced about scientific information across the pandemic. So when they can look at what is very clearly a pro-vaccination message and then not understand that it is pro-vaccination by the end of the pandemic, says that there are some critical, even with health literacy, even with preferring people's official sources, over a long prolonged crisis, we have some critical problems with infodemic management on the face, just by virtue of the uncertainty and people wanting to feel in control of the situation.
Hi, my name is Saman Chaudhary, and I'm conducting research on the risk communication by WHO, CDC, and MSF. And in my research, I had some really interesting findings where we are talking about health literacy and public engagement, even though we talk so much about science. But then the main thing is, even we talk about the first source of information, there is a problem with trust. We don't work enough to inculcate this element of trust and building public perception. Because here, I have a feeling we are really talking about top down, not the bottom up, right? When we talk about community engagement and you look at the comments section and online listening, how much do we inculcate that in our findings and in our research? So I think that is a really important component that WHO has to work on along with CDC. And during, as Diana used to say, during this quiet time, we need to really work on that. Yeah, that's just my 2 cents.
Sorry, I'm taking a lot of space, but I think that this is a very important comment. And of course, you are introducing here trust, which deserves another conference. And I would say, okay, let's immediately say that trust is a very complex concept, and it's so much depending on situation and context. So I don't want to enter there. But what I want to say here is that before I say it, I have a very strong opinion that risk communication, community engagement, infodemic management need to work as one. And the reason, for instance, you introduced the element of community engagement. In order to be able to develop risk communication that is trusted, you need to co-create it with the communities, and you need to co-deliver it through the influencers because you increase that trust. So again, the element, the argument of these 3 elements coming together is actually tapping on your point.
Yeah, and I can add also, I think it's trust, it's really complex issue, and it's somehow related to the countries. For instance, in my country, like generally we have maybe not high trust to the government, for instance. And when I was in Gothenburg, we talked about the difference. For instance, if the government recommend the people, for instance, in Norway or in Stockholm, Swedish, they consider it, okay, I have to follow it. Yeah. So it's cultural thing. And if somebody and something was recommended by government in my countries, most probably they will not follow it. So the trust is also a huge part and component of the communication, and it's not easy to create it just in one way. So it's really complex, and it's related to many things. And somehow we have opinion leaders, and it's not always positive. I mean, it's not always with the plus. Some opinion leaders could be not good people. And this is also another story. But I agree with you that the trust, it's very important, and it's really complex things.
Thank you, everyone. I just remembered what Bridget said, and I noted it down, complex interventions for complex settings. And then I sat here and I'm looking at the topic, it's bridging the evidence and action in emergencies. And I wondered practically, how would we be able to do this beyond health as a type of emergency, considering, we might be thinking about health, but what about other types of emergencies that there might be? And then practically as well, how do we distill this beyond geographies, beyond prolonged versus event-based? There's so much, but
So as opposed to just lumping everything together and trying to find, to what extent is a one size fit all the answer to this, or how much do we need to maybe break it down depending on geography, type of emergency, context, etc.
That's a nice complex one. You want, Christiana, do you want to go first or Audra? Audra's looks keen.
You want to
Yeah.
go first? Okay,
Yeah.
go.
Super quick to attribute something to Deanna, because one of the points that Deanna talks about a lot is that we can no longer afford to do research in single countries or even in single regions. We need to do more genuinely international research across all kinds of boundaries. So the fact that like in Central Asia, that they're looking to try and shoehorn European things in, or that our field remains dominated by American-based scholarship. These are things that we have to think about in the transfer, because the cultural component needs to be understood much more effectively. So I think the more that we can do multi-nation studies across different diversities, different complexities, we will start. And that's a good starting point.
Just to respond to this one size fits all idea, because I think that will not work. But I think that we have common points in crisis situation. And I think we can build kind of a decision tree that we decide depending on the situation, depending on the type of crisis, depending on other factors that influences how to react. And at the end, have a targeted solution for that. So, but this is some work we have to do. This doesn't exist yet. And we're at the beginning of this process, but this is work to be done by practitioners and researchers, again, together as a team.
On this, I mean, you mentioned other than health. I think are you meaning other than health infectious disease outbreak? Or is it other disasters? Is that your question?
Other disasters, climate change, information,
okay.
everything else. Yeah.
Okay, so I mean, like, and again, I refer to WHO work, and we work in emergencies in the context of all other emergencies. So it's infectious disease outbreak, but is also caused by climate change. So it can be disasters, natural, man-made conflicts, chemical. So it can be anything that has an impact on health. And I like this question because, for instance, we have worked throughout the COVID response, of course. So we learned a big deal in terms of health emergencies. And then we had Ukraine's war. And then we have Turkey earthquake. And we started to learn different things in the context of humanitarian emergencies. Of course, when we refer to the methodology of the research, this can apply. I mean, we can have a standardized methodology that we can use in different settings. What we need to be open to is that results might differ. And I make you an example. We have been talking about the uncertainty. The uncertainty is very specific, is more specific to infectious disease outbreak, where you have an evolution of the science and you have an evolution of the guidance. In a situation like an earthquake, we pretty know what is the situation, is what is going to happen. We have an understanding. So, for instance, the uncertainty element is less relevant there. In a situation like, for instance, the war in Ukraine, when we, of course, did, focus group discussion and intercept interviews to understand the needs and the priorities on refugees, we understood, for instance, that health was not a priority for them, and this is understandable. Of course, in a COVID outbreak, health is priority number one, at the top of everybody's mind. When it comes to Ukraine's war, I mean, what is at the top of their mind? Is livelihood, is life survival, is shelter, is not health. So you see that I would say that here the message is it's very important that we work together and identify and create the system and identify what methodology we want to use to achieve certain results and be open for these results to be different in different settings.
I'll come back over there. One of the things that we're hoping will happen over the course of these 3 days is that people will connect with each other to find collaborative points where you might want to do research and work together to co-create potential research projects. So this is a wonderful kickoff panel for that particular goal of this conference.
Thank you. I just wanted to ask a bit about, it's like a subsection of health, shall we say. Through, as you mentioned, you have wars, we've had pandemics, and I think probably, again, another reactive thing that we've discovered is that mental health gets affected big time. And then that creates sub-crises, smaller sub-crises, which can become actually, it can lead on to bigger crises, you know. Again, we look at Palestine, we look at COVID, there was a high suicide rate alone, let alone the fact that COVID was killing people, but people were killing themselves also because of the fact that there were many ways in which they couldn't handle it. It's probably a number of other ones to list. Has there been any work towards like actually applying some strategies here to allow preventative action that you can just kickstart the moment that something of a similar stance happens?
Well, coming from the public health perspective, we have this public mental health problem seen and defined, and there are a lot of efforts there. But again, coming from the research perspective, we have to face the situation that we often have more, well, not even misinformation, but critical information than data. Talking about suicide, that was a great discussion whether really suicide rates raised during and after COVID. And what we see with data is not actually as much as has been discussed. But of course, there are some ups and downs where we don't have yet the answer why this has happened. We had these economic problems of certain groups and certain populations. We had other problems. So the answer to this complex question is this is also an issue where we are at the beginning from public health perspective, but also from communication perspective then, because when we don't know the facts, it's hard to find strategies how to deal with it and not spreading more misinformation, which could even produce more harm than doing good.
Maybe, and mental health is definitely one of the issue on top of emergencies, particularly when it comes to humanitarian emergencies. Definitely Ukraine war, definitely Turkey earthquake, definitely Israel OTP. We as WHO Europe, we have been working with Israel because Israel is part of our region. So of course here I'm not entering any political discussion. We serve the people and we support the people. In Israel, the critical element has been mental health. We produce every 2 weeks a social listening report, which looks at the trends that are in the narrative. Mental health is number one. And of course, I mean, the mental health impact of what happened on the 7th of October are unimaginable, are huge. And we particularly, and of course, there has been a mental health response from our team, but we in particular, our department, RCCE-IM, we have been engaged in, for instance, engaging religious leaders to support people access to mental health services, including reducing the stigma. Because we have also research that says that many people felt they didn't want to do that, I mean, at that point, and they were postponing this. But we also have evidence saying very clearly that the more you postpone, the more you can actually amplify the problem. So we were trying to look at that from a community engagement perspective and actually leveraging on the mental health element to increase also the resilience of the community to this specific emergency and also in the future. But again, mental health is one of the top consequences of emergencies.
We're going to shut down the questions at this point because we want to have time for people to talk individually, one-on-one with people. So Ben, if you want to.
So I want to sum up the discussion. Yeah, well, I think we've had I mean, a lot of substance from the panel about, you know, what the challenge is, but also a lot of solutions identified of how to not just get rid of barriers, but also to co-create priorities for research, but also even interventions between researchers and public health authorities. And we got some great questions and insights coming from the audience here about how we can even go beyond just risk communication, crisis communication, community engagement, and infodemic management, and in general make research that's more relevant to the societies that we live in, but also by having research that involves multiple countries, multiple sectors, we come up with better solutions and better insights on how to respond to all kinds of emergencies, all kinds of hazards, from natural disasters and wars through to the next pandemic. So I think we've got a large amount of food for thought as we break for the poster session and maybe a few cups of coffee. And I think it's been a great start to the this conference. So look forward to continuing this conversation and having other ones over the next the remaining 2 days of the conference. Thank you, Diana, and thank you, audience.